Alright, tonight we're refuting Claude's claim that current U.S. high school curricula negatively impacts the development of creativity of students. His first secondary claim is that American youth creativity is declining. His second point is that creativity is actively discouraged in classrooms, and his third point is that students must absorb whatever content is given to them. Based on my research, I think that there's a lack of solid evidence to support the claim that creativity is being negatively impacted by U.S. high school curricula. Claude's first supporting point was that American youth is declining. He cited research that showed that creativity had been continuously declining among American school children over the last 30 years. And this statistic is according to the TTCT, which is the Torrance Test of Creative Thinking. I'm a graphic design major, and I speak personally, I think that creativity is kind of like arguably a subjective thing. And I also feel that trying to measure creativity through a standardized test seems to be kind of contradictory in nature. Anyways, TTCT was developed in 1966 by Dr. Paul Torrance, so this is a pretty old test, and it was last updated in 1998. So even at its most updated, it still is, you can argue, kind of an outdated measuring tool. And according to the Torrance statistics themselves, according to their manuals from 1966 and 1974, the test-retest reliability coefficients were around 0.5. So that's like a 50% consistency rate. So I think that's kind of an inconsistent statistic to use as your main point of evidence, and it didn't seem like that reliable of a source. In that same claim, he also cited that 23.6% of America's workers held creative jobs, and he said that in a way that 23.6 was a low number. But what constitutes a creative job? I mean, when you say creative job, do you mean a vocation in fine arts or graphic design, or do you simply mean a job that requires creative thinking or spontaneous decision making? And I thought that that was kind of a vague classification to use. The second supporting point introduced was that creativity is actively discouraged in classrooms. Claude claimed that assignments expected students to show technical mastery of a subject using specific rubrics and guidelines. Along with that, he also claimed that creativity wasn't rewarded based on these rubrics and guidelines. But there is no countrywide rubric, and there isn't a standard set of like rubrics and guidelines that are enforced in all schools. So that claim is kind of hard to confirm or deny, I think. And then in the subclaim, he cited a report about how an author named David Green heard about a girl that could read Harry Potter. So obviously she was pretty good at reading for her age, but she felt stupid when taking standardized tests. To me, this seemed like kind of an anecdotal example, and there wasn't any specific proof that this girl's situation was reflective of the country in general, and even if it was, it could just be like a small minority of students as a whole. So if that example is true, the girl apparently had been failed by the education system, but it could just be an isolated example of something and not something indicative of the country's students as a whole. I'd also like to point out that USnews.com suggests that students who are well-read do better on SATs, just simply based on the fact that they have a greater vocabulary understanding. reading skills are supposed to improve scores in SATs, so it seems like kind of a strange thing to use against it. The third and final supporting point that Claude brought up was that educators are restricted from straying outside the curriculum. He argued that teachers are pressured or mandated under their own evaluations to teach SAT prep and base their curriculum around preparing students for standardized tests to get into whatever college they need to get into. And he also argues that limited class time also makes this problem worse. And I could kind of tackle that first. There's a general class time in American high schools and stuff, so it's hard to argue with how long a class is or how long school days are. Ideally, teachers are supposed to blend all their things and find a way to involve creative thinking into their teaching. And also, teachers are required to teach standards and curriculum, not like the curriculum of schools aren't set by the SAT or whoever, like College Board or whoever sets up SAT or the ACT. It's set usually by the district or the state, so it seems like a weak argument to say that teachers are mandated to teach based on standardized test stuff, because that's what SAT prep is for, that you get outside of high school stuff. My conclusion is that there's not enough solid evidence to support the claim that creativity is being negatively impacted by U.S. high school curriculum. Statistics from creativity level tests are inconsistent and outdated. Studies suggest that well-read students do better on SATs than those who are not. And teachers aren't explicitly and specifically bound to SAT prep. The claim made shows evidence that any evidence or specific examples made could just be situational or just individual examples, and it's not necessarily indicative of the country's students as a whole.
Right, we had a couple of longer speeches, and I just want to point out that that won't happen when we have the debates, because we'll cut people off during the debates. So that went 7:27, so it's a little long. What would be 50% over? Something like that. So that's a little bit of a problem. Look, you clearly labeled the points that you're responding to. You do a good job kind of explaining each of those ideas. A lot of the arguments that you're making are the good presses on an argument, and I think I may have mentioned this before. A press is an argument that you're making when you have to make some kind of argument, but you don't have any proof on it. Your criticism of the TTCT, I thought, was reasonable, although I do think you've misunderstood what the 0.5% data reference that they have in there means. So I think that there's a little bit of confusion about that. I think that really is an indicator of confidence level that they are accurately measuring the thing that they're talking about, which means they're 95% certain that what they're measuring is the thing that the test looks at. So when you interpret it as it being, well, that means it's only correct half the time. I don't think that that's what it's saying. I'm not positive because I didn't read it. I'm just telling you there's plenty of doubt here. And if you've got a direct quote, quote it directly, as opposed to like your paraphrase or summary of that argument. The other argument that I thought you had there, where you're in essence challenging, well, what's their definition of creative job? I think that's a legitimate question, and it certainly seems like it makes a lot of assumptions about creativity. If we're going to suggest that there's a decline in creativity, what are some examples or proof? What do we don't have? And I'm surprised that you don't have some counter examples here. And when you say talking about creativity, there's been a lot of innovation in the last couple of dozen years here, and I think it would be easy to point to things that we're doing here that are substantially different, have improved things, altered the world and the way we see it, and the idea that we're becoming less creative, seems to be counterintuitive. So I think you could have built maybe a little bit more effective argument on that. There are a couple of other places where you've got some assertions. You get a little dragged out with the example of the Harry Potter girl, but the reading thing I think is a good point that you're making. And the SAT prep thing on the last point, I think the advocate's argument was that there's a tendency towards schools adopting more uniform systems, and that's the thing that creates the problem. And you kind of say, well, they don't do that, but that's your claim. The advocate's evidence seemed to be suggesting we're moving towards those sorts of things, and so I think you need to have something that's a little bit clearer in responding to that point. But you did a very nice job speaking to us and making your points.